Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today we have reached to the last lecture, and in today's lecture we will do the recap of the remaining parts of the chapters, topics and features that we studied in our whole course. In the first part of our revision, we did our revision from the start, that is about the understanding of the nature of the subject of stylistics and its historical background, till the understanding of two forms of stylistics, the literary and the formal stylistics or the linguistic stylistics, focusing on the significance of formalism for developing the subject and discipline of stylistics. Now from today we will look at how the theories proposed by the formalists in the form of the groundbreaking theory of formalism, that is reference to the idea of defamiliarization, deviation, automatization or parallelism, which comes under the broadening heading of the theory of foregrounding. The broader or the umbrella term of foregrounding encompasses within it the two types of the methods that we may use for the sake of bringing something to the foreground within the text. So today we will observe how the aspect that we refer to as a stylistic analysis depends upon identification of foregrounded features. What is foregrounded? How is it linked with the parallelism, deviation, tropes and schemes? Now, foregrounding is an umbrella term that encompasses within it two modes or ways of bringing something in the text to the foreground. Either it can be done by breaking the rules with the help of defamiliarization or deviation, which makes use of the features or literary devices which come under the heading of tropes. Or foregrounding can also be done by repetition, creating pattern and order, that is also called parallelism or automatization. And to create parallelism and automatization, the writers rely on such devices or literary devices and figures which are referred to as schemes or rule making. Now this is how the whole process of foregrounding is materialized or is completed. Foregrounding relies on two ways, automatization and defamiliarization, which is deviation and parallelism. And deviation and parallelism can be achieved with the help of devices which are tropes or devices which are schemes. Now let us understand what foregrounding is. As in our course we looked at in detail this theory, that is the theory proposed by the formalists referred to as the foregrounding, or the feature of literary writing, that is the foregrounding. Now as a general rule, anyone who wishes to investigate the significance of the work of art or literary writing must concentrate on the element of unusualness, the element of interesting aspects in the work, and the element of surprise within the text. So rather than focusing on the regular, automatic or usual known patterns of description, speech, language and writing, we ultimately focus our attention on what is deviant, what is abnormal, what is strange and unusual in a text. So this is what Jeffrey Leach has said about the importance and explanation of the term foregrounding. He says that foregrounding is in a text something that becomes the focus of attention of the reader, something that captures our attention and gains our interest, and we as a reader are committed to find out what that deviant, strange, unusual, striking feature means. Now foregrounding is a very convincing description or illustration of some idea that a writer wants to focus on, which he does not really wish to communicate in a very ordinary or simple a way. So the power of foregrounding suggests the significance of the art of writing, that how much the way a text is produced is as important as what a text is about. So initially, we used to focus on the messages, the themes, and the ideas conveyed by the writer, ignoring the fact that how much pain and effort did a writer take in order to present an idea. So in the modern criticism and modern methods of analysis of text, significance and quite significant attention is paid to the understanding, analysis, and the appreciation of the form of the work. And when the form of a work is paid attention to, in literary writings, the basic element that comes to the focus is the feature of foregrounding. So poets who make use of stylistic devices to make their writing unusual and attractive, they transport pieces of ordinary writing into poetic language, or they transport poetic language into non-poetic language. So this is the way we may find something unusual and strange or foregrounded feature in a work. For example, reading the works of the 20th century writer, that is the modern American poet T.S. Eliot, his most celebrated poem, A Wasteland. When we read The Wasteland, we find that the whole poem is the poetic expression, or the discourse that is followed is that of poetry. But within the poetic discourse that is confined into meter, rhyme, balance, and order, and is the poetic composition, we find certain passages which appear to be colloquial and conversational. Now, in the Wasteland, in the section referred to as the game of chess, in the game of chess, we find that Eliot has transported or made use of the dialogues that are taking place between two friends who meet at a bar. Now, those friends, in a very colloquial language and a very ordinary language, are talking about their concerns, which reveal their materialistic approach and their self-centeredness, how much they're concerned with their looks and their beauty, and how much they lack sincerity of emotions. Now, the idea that these two women who are friends meet in the parlor is quite unusual, an aspect that occurs within a poem that is a very formal poetic expression. So within the formal poetic expression, when a writer moves to an informal colloquial discussion or a dialogue taking place between two friends who are meeting in a bar or a parlor, is what strikes our attention. And we as a reader are surprised and find it a foregrounded feature, because the rest of the poem is following the discourse pattern that is quite regular to poetry, that sticks to the regularity of pattern in poetry. But within that, about 6-7 lines that occur, they take place as if they are taken into the poem out from the ordinary discussion or language going on in some parlor or a bar. So that bar parlor monologue by Eliot is the example of foregrounding within the poetic language that is sticking to the rule and order, whereas the bar parlor scene of about 7-8 lines is not in line with the poetic language, but is colloquial in expression. Similarly, another example of foregrounding can be found in another of T.S. Eliot's poem, that is The Hollow Men. In Hollow Men, another poem by T.S. Eliot, we see that the poem is confined to the discourse that is for the grown-ups and adults who read and understand the meaning of the spiritual decay and modern man's inertia and his disillusionment and the psyche of the modern man who is hollow and spiritless. Within that poem that is quite serious and also has tragic overtones, we find Eliot interpolating a stanza that seems like a nursery rhyme, that is like children going around a bush singing a song that is a nursery rhyme. Here we go round the prickly pear, prickly pear, prickly pear. This is what the children chant. Now, these 4 lines that occur within a serious poem that has got a serious theme and message and a very dignified and elevated language too, that is serious poem. In it, when we come to a point where Eliot has transported 4 lines from a nursery rhyme, we find it so strange and unusual that it strikes us that it is out of the context of the poem. So that becomes another foregrounded feature, or an irregularity of pattern, that the writer has broken the rules of writing within the confines of poetic expression, and he has changed from the elevated serious poetic style to the nursery rhyme pattern that is more closer to the expression that are suitable for children's literature rather than serious or literature that is serious or for adults. Now, as we know what foregrounding is, that it is anything that is brought to light by the writer, either through parallel structure or repetition, or through deviation or disruption. Now, since deviation, parallelism are both what come under foregrounding, and foregrounding is the unusualness, strangeness of expression, and it has got a purpose too. We have to relate the writer's motives with the use of language and the deviant use of language that might be foregrounded feature. Now, ultimately it calls for interpretation. Any feature that is the highlight, that is the deliberate use of language in a deviant and unusual way that strikes you, is to be interpreted. Now, the role of interpretation in foregrounding is what we studied in detail. After the study of the topic of foregrounding, we in our study of the course moved to the understanding of what is the relationship of interpretation with foregrounding. Now, interpretation is not something that in stylistics could be taken as randomly depending upon our whims and wishes, attitudes and feelings. Rather, in stylistic analysis, interpretation is to be bound within 3 parameters. For example, we look at interpretation first, and we will look at how the 3 instances of interpretation are acceptable for the interpretation of literary texts if you are looking at a text from a stylistician's orientation. Now, what is interpretation? Interpretation is the action or process of understanding the meaning of any writing, thought, idea, explanation. Either it is complex or ambiguous, or simple or known. Now, interpretation is done for the sake of understanding something, for the sake of deciding about the meaning of something or the purpose of something, either idea, thing, word, symbol, image. So either you analyze a word, image, symbol or a metaphor, you are performing the work that is referred to as interpretation. Interpretation is required for the understanding of literary works because it gives clarity and it reveals its implications, either psychological, moral, religious, political or cultural. So all these implications or symbolic or metaphoric meanings become clear when we interpret a text, a word, a symbol or an image. Now, interpretation in the study of stylistics is necessary because in literary writings, the writers do not present ideas directly. They cover something in a way that seems to be, ambiguous, unclear and unusual. So as a reader, we interpret to peel off the layers of meaning and to understand what the writer has conveyed to us. Now, what distinguishes literary discourse from the ordinary language and discourse is that literary discourse is replete with symbols, images, literary devices like metaphors and symbols or other such embellishments and devices, which have multiple meanings or which may have a meaning which may not be evident from its surface. So our ordinary conversation is quite straightforward, that we hardly need to interpret it. So when we are talking to a friend or a sister or a brother, we don't use such words which are symbolic or have metaphoric meaning or have connotational meaning or have referential meaning. We talk directly to make somebody understand what we mean. hardly or rarely do we make use of puns or sarcastic remarks or ironic remarks which have got double meanings or double entendres. But literary writings abound with such expressions, and they make demands to the reader that he must interpret it. And when a reader is to interpret it, what sources of interpretation and what ways of interpretation he is supposed to rely on. Now there are three ways to interpret something which are recommended in stylistic analysis. For example, the first way, as we discussed in our discussion about interpretation, was that we try to judge what the writer's intention is. But it is very difficult to start our judgment and analysis of a word or a phrase or a poem or a text from the perspective of the writer, because the writers do not supply manuals with their writing. They do not supply the key books or guidebooks regarding how to study their work. Now, the key books might be written by other people. As you, being the student of literature, must be aware of the fact that you find multiple sources by many students and other authors and writers and critics who talk about Dickens, who talk about Virginia Woolf, who talk about Keats's poems, giving explanations. But the writers themselves have never written any explanation of their work. So it means that a writer's intentions are mostly hidden beyond the reach of the reader. So that becomes very difficult for us to interpret unless we have understanding of the biography of the writer or his time, his psychological bent of mind, his place, society in which he lived, his family background, or the biography of his life is what we may take aid from. That why did he write this thing? For example, reading Dylan Thomas's poem that we analyzed in the in our lecture on the analysis of a poem, where he had talked about do not go gentle into that good night. If we try to locate the biographical record of that poem, so we get to know that Dylan Thomas was writing that poem for his father, who was sick and was almost near to death. Now, this is the biographical information that has told us for the interpretation that the poem is addressed to the poet's father, and it was written at a time when he was in great agony to see his father in sickness nearing death. Now, this is what we may get to know about the information that we have taken about the author's life, that we can apply it on the understanding of a text, that what a text means. It is not referred to generally to the every old person, but it had immediate sort of association with the poet's life, because in that he was addressing his own father. Now, this interpretation would limit us. It would not let us to look at the more broader aspects of the meaning of a text. That is why this is the most unreliable and unsuitable an interpretation that a stylistician is supposed to carry out. Now, the second option of interpretation that is available to the reader and a stylistician is that he focuses on the text. Now, the text has got the words, the way they are formed, what meanings they carry, as it is their denotational and connotational meaning that works for the reader to make the judgments. So the reader does not take into account his personal whims and wishes. Rather, he focuses on what the words mean within the text, how the words act and react upon the other words, what are the connections of these words with the title of the work, with the ending of the work, with the characters within the work, with the situation within the work. So focusing only on the text rather than its reference or the society, the time, the place, the author. The most suitable approach of interpretation is focusing on words and looking at their multiple meanings, and then finding out the relationship between the words, how each word relate to carry out an idea. For example, if you have to look at Dylan Thomas's poem from the second perspective of interpretation, that is a text-centered approach or a word-centered approach in which we find connection between words, that how the words like wise men, grave men, wild men have brought to light the nation or the people, and then how the words like sad height and the word like Green Bay refer to the idea of heaven, and the importance of even religion, or the image of Father in the form of Christ have got the religious connotations too. Now, this religious connotation of the work, the biblical connotation of the work, or the societal connotation of the work has been discerned by us as readers or stylisticians on the basis of our focus on the meaning of the words. What a word means within the poem, what a word means in the larger perspective within the society or the world when it is received by the reader. Then comes the third way of interpreting a text. In that third way of interpreting the text, we look at the text from the angle of how we relate to it, how reader relates to it. Now, this third interpretation is a reader-centered approach of interpreting a text, that is referred to as the reader-centered approach. Here, what a word means to me as a reader or interpreter is more important than what the word stands for. So there comes the very personal aspect where the reader is the one who gives meaning to the text. Now, text was produced by the writer, but once it has been written, it becomes the property of the reader, because the writer's personality has been subsided by the personality of the person reading it. Now, the reader brings his own knowledge, that is his previous knowledge or his experiences, his social, political, psychological background, as well as his worldview, his education, his knowledge to the text. So the knowledge that I have, if I apply it to the text, depending upon the religion that I profess, the education that I possess, the psychological, cultural, sociological, or political points of views that I hold, are what would signify what the text means. So these are the three ways of interpreting a text, either through the eye of the author, through the eye of the reader, or just by focusing on the text. So these are the three ways. One is the text-centered approach, one is the reader-centered approach, one is the author-centered approach for the interpretation of the analysis. And which one is the best one? Of course, none can be claimed to be the best one. Why? Because in different situations, we need to incorporate all the three approaches of interpreting a text to make the analysis more vigorous and strengthen it. At times, we need not pay attention to the author-centered approach and look at it from only the perspective of the text as well as the reader. Now, it depends upon how and why are you interpreting a text, and what you need to do for the text. For if you are reading the text for the sake of conveying the ideas to the readers as the students, you are to teach them all the three approaches. But if you are looking at a text from the point of view that you are performing a formal analysis or stylistic analysis, you are to focus on the text-centered approach as well as the reader-centered approach, keeping away the author-centered approach. But if you are looking at it from the point of view of a literary critic, you will be starting from the author's perspective, or what the writer's life denotes, that the text has come to this particular shape or form by any intention or influence of the society and time and the life that he has led. Now, after the study of the importance of interpretation for foregrounding, we moved to look at the two basic elements of foregrounding. And one of the major aspects of foregrounding is deviation. If a writer wants to bring something to the foreground or focus within a text, he may choose to deviate from the norms. He may choose to break the rules of writing. Conventional rules, standard rules of writing and speech are broken or violated in order to produce the effect of foregrounding, and that is referred to as deviation. Now, linguistic deviation and linguistic parallelisms, these are the two ways through which a writer can produce foregrounding. So either a writer may bring something to the focus or front through the use of deviation, or he may choose to bring something to the foreground or forefront with the help of parallelism. So first, we will look at deviation, that how a writer, if he chooses to bring something to the forefront or highlight something in the text, either a poem or a fiction, he may choose the method referred to as rule breaking, which is deviation, or it also can be referred to as defamiliarization. Now, if an author defamiliarizes, he sort of revives our interest in something that has become habitual, boring, or uninteresting. Now, deviation occurs when we have a set of rules or expectations which are broken in some way, like the way you can see on the screen that in this slide, one line that is like the way this font has changed. Now, don't you see that this stands out from the rest of the text because it is deviant, it is in italics, the rest of the lines are in regular font, the first and the third line is in regular font, whereas the second line is in italics. So if this is a very simple way of observing a change, a deviation, a disruption of order, an abnormality within the normality, then in literature too there might be ways which writers adopt, which might be orthographic, which might be semantic, which might be morphological ways to deviate from the normal patterns and standards of language. So this deviation is referred to as the breaking of rules and disruption of the expected expression and pattern of language and writing. So why do the writer choose to use it? Usually, why do the writers used to choose is that they want to surprise us, they want to evoke our interest in their writing, and they want to make their writing appear different, unusual, strange, and more attractive. Otherwise, their works would have become boring or so simple that we may not derive pleasure reading those, because every writer wants to experiment. Either he wants to bring some new method, way, or form of expression, or even he may choose to write about some unusual way or unusual theme as well. So if the themes are what we may find to be repeated in the works of poets and writers, they would also like to do some experimentation with the form or the method of narration. Now, in most of the instances, deviation is linguistic, because it is the artful use of language that makes the reader feel that they have encountered something new or strange. For example, in Dylan Thomas's poem that is titled as Grief Ago, the very expression grief ago surprises us. We looked at it in detail in our discussion of the topic of deviation, that how Dylan Thomas's expression a grief ago captures our attention, it surprises us, and it seems a foregrounded feature or irregular feature, because we know that time cannot be measured with the feeling. It is measured with either minute, seconds, that is the duration of the time, or years. Now, instead of measuring it with the regular way in which he should have used a year, month, or days, he measures it with grief. Now, if we say a happiness ago or a grief ago, that is deviation. Why? Because the regular way is to measure passing of time or passage of time with any entity of time, minute, second, to year, decade, month, hour. So here the phrase a grief ago comes to the forefront, and it sticks to our memory too. We appreciate its deviation. We appreciate its breaking the rules of the grammatical construction. So it is doubly foregrounded. How we say that Dylan Thomas wrote this poem with the same title, which breaks both the rules. We notice on the last page rules that are doubly foregrounded. So it is grammatically and both semantically deviant. So the meaning is also deviant, and the grammatical composition is also deviant. So it turns the poem into an expression that is memorable, that is foregrounded irregularity, as it is the use of deviation. Now, we know that linguistic deviation is the disruption or the breaking of the normal process and pattern of communication, because it leaves a gap in the reader's mind. So when the comprehension is complicated, when we are receiving a sort of shock or surprise as to what the writer means Why didn't we ever experience this expression before? And why is this expression also correct, true, and meaningful? Now, in interpretation of the very phrase grief ago, we realize that since the persona or the speaker in the poem is talking about time becoming still for him after a shock or a tragedy that he had been through. So he is measuring his life with the feeling that he had been under. And that feeling of sadness, if it prevailed for so long, had become the kind of concept through which he has measured time. Now time to him has turned into tragedy or sadness. That is why he measures it as a grief ago rather than a year ago. So the gap that occurred initially is filled through interpretation, through justification of the use of this deviation, that how meaningful this deviation had been, that it is not just a grammatical or semantic violation which is the mistake or error, rather it is deliberate. The writer has chosen an unusual way which never occurred to any of us, but to the writer it has become a very way of expressing his feelings and emotions. So we judge this deviation as unusual and strange expression when we put it and measure it against what is normal, what is regular, what is usual. And the usual is a year ago, unusual and deviant is a grief ago. So our comprehension of the meaning becomes more sound and clear when we put the oddity against the regular use. So in case of this and also in case of a metaphor, the compensation is in the form of an analogy. So we feel that the writer has drawn an analogy between two unlike things. Now, deviation depends upon two very interesting elements, that this is what is in the reader's mind as well as in the writer's mind initially when they create a text. The writer makes use of some deviant expression or makes use of deviation to create foregrounding in the text because he wants to make the reader attend to the text, take interest in the text, and he also wants to surprise the reader. So when, as a reader, on encountering a text, we experience a feeling of surprise, as well as we feel interested to know something that is strange and unusual, we are encountering a deviation for the sake of interpretation. So the two elements that are connected to deviation are the element of interest and the element of surprise. Now, any deviation, first of all, evokes the interest of the reader. Since any deviation is unusual, strange, and very much irregular use of language and expression, it appears appealing to the reader, and the reader stops and thinks, what is this? Why is it so? Just the way we stopped and pondered over the fact that the grief ago seems wrong. The grief ago is something that contrasts with our understanding of measuring of time. Now, another element that is connected to deviation is that of surprise. Anything that is deviant in literary writing is what surprises the reader. We have a feeling of elevation, we have a feeling of you can say happiness too while encountering a deviation, because we are not familiar with what the writer has created or invented. So in deviation, we notice that something that appears to be confusing, strange, unusual, and it does not fit into the regular expression of communication, we look at it as something interesting. And when we point it out as interesting and unusual, as a result of that, we feel that surprise on encountering it, that how artful and tactful the writer had been to capture our attention or to baffle us or to confuse us. Now, in solving that confusion that the author has created, we go through an exercise of the mind in order to interpret that. So that exercise also surprises us that some deviant aspect that initially appeared to be unbelievable, how logical, how plausible and significant that becomes. Now, when we dismissed a grief ago as a wrong expression because it should have been a year ago, for example, this is what we are familiar with. We did not dismiss it as a wrong expression, rather we recognized it as deviation, as foregrounding, or we applauded the writer's creativity to create such an expression. Why? Because the writer has given a new way or new perspective of looking at things. Now that perspective that is developed by the writer is the surprising thing, is the interesting thing. So that is why we say that the element of interest and surprise are evoked through deviation. We ask certain questions when we encounter a deviation, like what does this mean? How is it possible? And what is its significance? So any deviation is accompanied by a question mark. Why is it used? What does it mean? And what is its significance? Then, after our understanding of the concept of deviation and the basic elements that deviation makes use of, we had also discussed in our course the types of deviation. Our deviation has got many types, and we looked at these 8 types of deviation with the help of examples. Now, you should be able to understand what each type means, and you should also be able to identify these types of deviations in the texts that you read. Either in poetry, prose, plays, fiction, you will find examples of all these deviations, and you must be able to locate those examples in all the texts that you read in your study of English literature. The first type that we looked at is lexical deviation. That is the way words are formed or the way the words are created. Then the second type of deviation is the grammatical deviation. In grammatical deviation, we notice that the writers make use of erroneous or sort of wrong grammar in order to take interest or to make the reader feel interested in the text in order to deviate. Then we looked at phonological deviation as well, where through repetition of sounds like alliteration or assonance, the writers create an effect or the similarity within the text. Then we looked at graphological deviation, or the oddity in the expression of writing, that how the graphology or the orthography of a work, either the unusual use of capitalization or ignoring the capitalization and punctuation, they all become the graphological or orthographic features of the script or writing, and how do they convey meaning as well if they are deviant use of expression and language. We also looked at semantic deviation, where we find irregularity of meaning or the use of, for example, pun or the use of a metaphor and symbol are all semantic deviations, because there the meaning is changed, the meaning is enhanced. Also, another type of deviation is referred to as a dialectical deviation, where a writer may make use of the dialect from another language. He would, shift into a regional dialect while sticking to the standard dialect or expression. So that can be referred to as dialectical deviation. Then the deviation of register, where different registers might be mixed. For example, in poetic register, a poet might incorporate the register of colloquial language, or the songs or rhymes or jokes as well, or the political register also, or the register of the news discourse too. So apart from this, we also had a look at the historical deviation. Now, the historical deviation can be understood in a way that if a writer makes use of obsolete, old, archaic words which no longer are functional or used in the present time. So if a writer makes use of a thing of the past in the form of expression or a word or a work, or even if a writer makes use of a genre of a past, for example, epics are the old way of expression used in poetry. So if the old way of the expression of poetry is revived within a poem, and a writer makes use of certain aspects which are used in epic, we would refer to it as historical deviation, because in contemporary time hardly do we find people writing epics. Now, these are the types of deviations that we looked at, and this is what a writer may choose to use in order to foreground something in a text. So foregrounding can be achieved with the help of the use of any of these or all of these 8 types of deviations, which range from the deviation of style of expression, that is orthographic deviation, or deviation at the level of meaning and syntax or sentence formation as well. So these are the types of deviations which we looked at with the help of examples too, and I suggest to you that you must be able to find out at least 2 examples of any of these deviations from the works, either poetry or prose, that you have studied, apart from those examples that I've discussed with you in the lectures. So it would help you to apply the knowledge of these types and definitions on the works that you study. So finding out the examples of these deviations in those texts that you have read would help you test your knowledge or understanding of these deviations and definitions. So after the study of the topic of deviation, we looked at in detail the second aspect of foregrounding, that the writers choose to foreground something, to bring some idea in writing to the forefront or make it prominent. They may also choose to rule making. So if deviation is rule breaking, parallelism is referred to as rule making, sticking to the rule. Now it is not only regularity, but rather Jeffrey Leach refers to it as extra regularity, because if you notice the use of alliteration, alliteration is extra regularity because a writer is sticking to the same rule religiously. So when we define parallelism, we say that parallelism is what occurs at the level of words and sounds. Deviation might occur at the level of words but leading us to the change in meaning. But here we find that parallelism is not connected so closely to the meaning, because it doesn't change the meaning of a work or a text. Rather, it changes the form, the appearance, and the expression of literary writing. So a parallel structure joins 2 or more recognizably similar or yet not so identical structures. And parallelism can be just like deviation or repetition. It can occur at all the levels of language, but mostly it occurs at phonological, syntactical, and morphological level rather than semantic level. So parallelism is connected with similarity, repetition, structure, order, balance. That is mostly what operates at the level of phonology, at the level of syntax, or at the level of morphology. It is frequently used in poetry. That one of the very effective features of poetry is that it has to be memorable. Now, in order to add to the memorability, the poets rely on parallelism, because the feature of parallelism creates repetition. And when a writer repeats certain words, sounds, sentences, phrases, ideas, those ideas become quite, automatic to the reader, and they remember those. So if you read poetry, you will come across many features which would appear parallel or regular features, or foregrounding through parallelism would reveal how it creates automatization, that certain patterns are brought to the reader again and again, so that become regular and automatic, and the reader remembers those things. Now this is the very quality because of which you do not forget songs. You do not make any effort to memorize a song, but you hear it once because of its rhythm, rhyme, meter, and repetitions, and the way it chants or repeats the lines of the beginning at the end of every stanza. You feel that you remember the songs more quickly, or you still remember the nursery rhymes that you might have read in your school or in your nursery class, that you might not have repeated them, you might not have read them in the last 20 or so years, but still you think that you remember those. Now, what is that that makes those songs and poems memorable? It's parallelism, the rhyme, the repetition, the alliteration, assonance, consonance, internal rhyme. That is parallelism which makes the songs and poems memorable. So it's a rhetorical device that, if you have to stress an idea, if you have to present an idea as the major idea, you repeat it. So repetition is a device to make us understand something as if it is important, as if it is necessary for us to know. So it is frequently used as a rhetorical device in both literary and non-literary writings as well. For example, in speeches you come across many parallel structures. For example, if a politician says that I want this nation to progress, to excel, to achieve glory. Now, instead of saying that I want this nation to excel, progress and achieve glory, he says I want this nation to excel, to progress and to achieve glory. Now, the repetition of the same structure, to progress, to achieve glory, to excel, is parallelism used in a speech for the sake of creating stress, for the sake of creating similarity of rhythm and rhyme within a prose expression, and also for the sake of emphasis, that is the rhetorical emphasis that is added to an expression with the help of parallelism. You find examples of parallelism in songs, poems, political speeches, in jokes, in nursery rhymes, also in the jingles of advertisements that you watch on TV, or even the slogans of political parties, or the slogans written on the billboards of certain advertisements as well. And you find parallelism also in the tongue twisters too. So look at how common the use of parallelism is, which we might have overlooked, but is so useful in making an impact on the reader or the listener. And that is the deliberate use of foregrounding or automatization. That is a feature of literary writing that is adopted even in non-literary texts and works too. Now, we understand parallelism as a foregrounded regularity because we studied deviation as foregrounded irregularity. In deviation, pattern was broken or disrupted. In parallelism, pattern is created, or we adhere to the pattern quite strictly. So parallelism is a type of foregrounding in which we get a sense that is the opposite of deviation, for it consists in the introduction of extra regularity or extra patterning into language. So when regularity and extra patterning is added, we call it foregrounding through parallelism. Now, to the extent it is used to such an extent that any use of language consists in regularity or obeying rules. But what is parallelism is, it is extra regularity, because language is regular or obeying rules. But if we stick to rules quite forcefully, then as Jeffrey Leach calls it, ruledness, that rules are adhered to, or we stick to the rules more religiously, that the way it is breaking the pattern of regularity and becoming extra regularity. So in any language in general, both in poetry and in prose as well, we find such extra regularity, that is sticking to the pattern far more beyond the pattern of regularity that is required from the perspective of standard use of language or standard grammar of language. Now let us look at the aspects of parallelism which make it distinctive. As we say that parallelism is regularity, but regularity to an extent where it becomes extra regularity. Now, what are the features that parallelism itself contains that make it an extra regularity? Observe that parallelism in this line, that is example of Goldsmith's expression in a poem. He had said that where wealth accumulates and men decay. Now look at the structure of the words, where wealth accumulates and men decay. Now the segments of the sentence, the first segment comprising of 3 words, and the second segment also comprising of the 3 words. There is correspondence between the first word of the first part and the first word of the second part, like and where correspond, wealth and men correspond, accumulate and decay correspond. Now we see that they are connectives. Where and are connectives. Where is an indicative as well. and we see decay and accumulate as nouns. We see men and wealth as objects. In one case it is a human, in the other case it is an object or a commodity like money. Now accumulates and decay, that also shows the sticking to the same tense, that is the present tense, that is the simple present tense. Now man is plural, that is accompanied by the correct use of the verb, that is decay, and wealth is accompanied with the use of the word accumulates with the addition of the es in case of the use of indefinite tense. Now there parallelism resides not in the identity of the clauses, that is subject and verb, but in the effect that each element of the clause consists of one word, and then if it is for example changed into where wealth accumulates and wise men decay, good men decay, noble men decay, it would have lost its parallelism or balance of structure. Now we see that it would have become considerably weaker had it been added before the word men, any qualifier like good men, evil men, or you can say wise men. So we see that the grammatical correspondence between where and wealth and men accumulates and decay creates parallelism. Even the repetition of the sounds like where and wealth with the very sound of wo, and we see that the correspondence between the nouns, that is the opposition. One thing is increasing, the other is decreasing. So we see wealth increasing and men decreasing. That again creates correspondence or opposition that brings to focus the binary or the antithetical situation or position of the two objects explained. Now that we have observed this example in order to highlight the fact that how parallelism may be not just parallelism that comprises of repetition of sound, which may be the use of you can say alliteration, or repetition of words like anaphora. It can also comprise of the element of antithesis, where correspondence is created between two opposite things. Now we judge one thing by putting it beside the other due to its dissimilarity, due to its contrast with the other. For example, men and wealth are contrasting because men are human beings, the acme of the creation, and wealth is a commodity, something that is not full of life. Then accumulation and decay also contrast. Now accumulation is increase and decay is decrease, that is again antithetical or contrasting. Now let us look at the salient features of formalism, or rather, now let us look at the two important features of parallelism, just the way we observe the two important features of deviation. Now interest and surprise were the important features of deviation, whereas identity and contrast are the significant features that parallelism carries. Now for anything that has to be parallel or that has to form extra regularity within the text and use of language, it has to have the element of identity, or it must at the same time have the element of contrast. So just having identity too would make it parallel structure, but sometimes along with identity or repetition, a parallel structure also carries the element of contrast or dissimilarity, the way we noticed in the last example where we read the line by Goldsmith, where wealth accumulates and men decay. So in that expression we have seen identity as well as contrast. Now the element of identity and contrast is inherent or quite closely bound with parallelism, the way interest and surprise is bound with deviation. Identity is similarity, regularity, order. Contrast is the binary or opposition or antithesis. According to Roman Jacobson, any form of parallelism is apportionment of invariance and variable. So in other words, he means to say that parallel patterns have an element of identity and contrast. So if there is a parallel pattern, if there is a deviant structure in terms of language where there is extra regularity, such deviation in extra regularity or such foregrounded in extra regularity would carry these two elements, either just the element of identity or the identity element combined with contrast. Now, identity is there, for example, the sentence that is the example that he raised a mortal to the sky, she drew an angel down. Now, in that expression, we find many words, structures which are parallel. At the same time, we find the element of identity. But there might be instances like the furrow followed free, where we find just the element of identity and identify it as parallelism. But in the example, he raised a mortal to the sky, she drew an angel down, we find both the elements, identity as well as contrast. So it depends upon the use of parallelism, that how a writer chooses to do so. Either he has used only the element of identity in the creation of parallelism, or he also has used the element of contrast along with identity. So the more complicated use of parallelism is when a writer, along with the use of identical structures, patterns or rhymes within language and sound, also makes use of contrast, antithesis or any such other device which disrupts the perception and turns it towards the opposite of the meaning which has been intended in the initial phrase or line. So apart from the study of the two elements that are the element of identity and contrast, in our study of the concept of parallelism, we looked at what functions does parallelism perform. Now, the functions of parallelism are very significant, because parallelism may be a device which does not really have much connection with meaning, because it doesn't change meaning as deviation does. But it adds so much to the expression in terms of its rhetorical significance, its ability to lead the reader towards the more profounder meanings and understandings. So let us look at the functions of parallelism one by one in just a glance. That firstly, we looked at the fact that how parallelism is connected with rhetorical emphasis. So when a writer wishes to focus on something or to make some point as a point of discussion, he returns to it. He comes back to it for the sake of reiterating it. So when he reiterates it or recaptures it, that is done for the sake of creating rhetorical emphasis, or the emphasis that you want in your speech and writing. Then another important feature or another important function that parallelism performs is that it aids memorability. So the repetitions make it easier for the reader or the listener to remember it. Another important function of parallelism is that it is connected with the element of identity and contrast. So it surprises the reader as well. It challenges the reader as well to find out the difference between the two things which appear to be similar in structure and composition. The similar structure might be easy to understand, but the complexity that is brought to light by the image of contrast or antithesis is what creates confusion, or is what creates complication for the reader if he has to interpret or decide about the meaning of that use of parallelism. Then another most significant function of parallelism is that it may lead to climax, because it leads you gradually, step by step, to most profounder and grave or serious a thought that the writer wishes to convey in a poem or in a speech or text. So these are the important functions that we studied in the study of parallelism that it performs. For example, it is used for emphasis in speech, it is used to make the readers and listener remember the facts which are important, it is used to create identity and contrast, as well as it leads to climax or the more important point within the text or writing. Then our discussion brought us to the study of the kinds of parallelism. Now, kinds of parallelism can well be identified in poetry, because it is poetry basically that mostly relies on the creation of regularity of structure and pattern. So in our understanding of the kinds of parallelism, we looked at with the help of example on certain poems which make use of these types of parallelisms. That first one was synonymous parallelism. Now, as the name suggests, we looked at that synonymous parallelism makes use of repetition of sounds and words, either the use of alliteration or anaphora. So that is referred to as synonymous parallelism when a writer sticks to the same sound or pattern. Then we looked at the next type, that is antithetical parallelism, where there is use of antithesis. So identification of antithetical parallelism is not difficult, because antithesis or contrast is what makes us understand that this is parallelism. The third type of parallelism was synthetic parallelism. Now, as the word synthesis suggests, it is advancing thoughts. That one thought is lesser, then the next thought in the next line would be built upon the same thought, leading to a more greater height or intensity. Then introverted parallelism is reversal or the disruption. It reverses the thought that is expressed in the first part, and then the second phrase would reverse it or invert it. Then fifth form of parallelism was stair-like parallelism, where thought is built up upon a thought gradually. For example, leading from rivers and waters to streams and finally to the sea. So this is the building up of a thought upon thought, that from a smaller entity or idea, the writer led us to a more profounder thought. For example, pricking, bleeding, hurting, and then killing or dying. Now these are the ways the writer is leading us from step by step to the idea of death. From pricking, bleeding, or getting hurt, we reach to the more profounder and grave thought that lies up there in the form of death or killing. Then emblematic parallelism is to be identified with the fact that it makes use of extended simile. So when a writer makes use of a simile and extends the use and explanation of simile with the similar patterns and repetition of words, that is referred to as emblematic parallelism. So this is what we looked at in the terms of understanding of parallelism and its kinds, and then we connected the idea of parallelism and deviation with the study of schemes and tropes. We identified that schemes are used to create parallelism and tropes are used to create deviation. Tropes change meaning, schemes create regularity. So we looked at two types of schemes, that is schemes which is repetition of sounds and schemes which is repetition of words. Now alliteration, assonance, consonance, sibilance, these are all schemes that repeat sounds. And the schemes which repeat words include anaphora, epanellepsis, epistrophe, and symplock. We looked at in detail that sometimes initial word is repeated, sometimes the last word is repeated, sometimes the same is the same, sometimes in the repeated lines the beginning and ending is the same. So how they all fit into either anaphora, epanellepsis, epistrophe, or symplock. Then in the study of foregrounding, we looked at the examples of alliteration and anaphora would be for the study of parallelism, and they come into schemes. And pun and metaphor might be the examples which come into disruption of the meaning, change of the meaning, which might be referred to as deviation. And then looking at the kinds of tropes, apart from the kinds of schemes which were figures of repetition of sound and figures of repetition of words, we came to tropes which change meaning. And within tropes, we divided the tropes into four types and categories. Tropes which involve changing the meaning, which is semantic irregularity. They include paradox, antithesis, oxymoron. And those figures or tropes which involve comparison of one thing with another, they include metaphor, simile, personification, and conceit. We looked at each of these with examples, so it is just a recap to make you understand where do they stand and what is the connection of these tropes with parallelism and deviation, and under the broader heading of foregrounding. Then the third type of trope that we looked at was the group of figures that involve substitution. And substitution images are metonymy and synecdoche, part for whole, and material and product relationship. Then we looked at the fourth category of tropes. We divide those tropes on the basis of the fact that either they add or minus the meaning, or amplify the meaning, or diminish the meaning. The amplifying object for the sake of meaning was hyperbole, which exaggerates the meaning, adds the meaning, extends the meaning, and the opposite of it, which substitutes the meaning, or which rather subtracts the meaning, is litotes. So these were the four groups into which we divided tropes. But these are not just all the tropes. There are many other. Keeping in view the limited time and scope of our study, I just chose to introduce you to these four kinds, either the semantic irregularities, or the figures of comparison, or figures of substitution, or the figures of amplification and subtraction. But there are certain other schemes and tropes too which exist. So if the study of stylistics could be focused only on the study of schemes and tropes, it would have consumed almost half of the time of our discussion. So for the sake of introducing ourselves to what are the tropes and schemes, which come under the broader heading of parallelism and deviation, and become the figures through which a writer foregrounds any aspect in writing, we confined ourselves to these four types of tropes and these two types of schemes or repetitions. So this is the recap of the whole course that we studied. We looked at the makeup of stylistics, what it is made up of, how did it come into use, where does it stand in the modern canon of literature, how does it take the help in order to arrive at understanding of the text from the linguist as well as from the literary critic. What are the theories proposed by the formalists which make up the basis of stylistic analysis, and how in the contemporary time stylistic analysis has come to be labeled as an analysis which takes into account not just the linguistic analysis but also discourse analysis. So I hope that you understand the concepts that I try to revise with you, and inshallah if you keep these guidelines in your mind, you will be able to perform a very comprehensive and detailed and accurate stylistic analysis of any literary as well as non-literary text. Thank you.